when do we need to use authentication and or authorization? It's when there's behavior that we need to control access to, whether it's reading data, editing data, sending emails, connecting to another system, whatever it might be. If there's some kind of data or some kind of interaction that you need to control access to limit it to certain users or certain situations, certain other systems, for example, they don't have to be users. That's when you need to think about authentication and authorization. So to use a simple example here, suppose we have a microblogging service that we're trying to build. And in this service, we have posts, right? This is like an entity in our microblogging service. You could think of it as an entity, an object of a class, a row in a database, a resource in a RESTful model. It doesn't really matter. And this entity, there are certain operations that you can perform on it. You can edit it. You can edit the post, change the content of it. You can delete it. And you can also view it. And this is a simplification, right? I'm just trying to get the point across here. So say you have this entity, you have these three operations for it. Let's turn this into a group and make a couple of these. Okay, so, again, supposing this is a microblogging service or a forum or something like that, any user is able to view any post, right? They're basically public posts. And so we can kind of draw this line here to say any user is able to view any post. And for that, you don't really need any authentication or authorization. Now, if you have to be a user, meaning you literally have to be logged into the app with a username and password or something like that, then you need authentication. That's the authentication part, and I'll get into that in a minute. But if it's just a post that's publicly available on the internet, all you have to do is go to the page, then you don't need authentication. And maybe let's actually just say anyone instead of any user to avoid the confusion there. Okay, so then what about editing and deleting, right? Only the user who created the post is able to edit it. So let's say user A created post A. User A is able to edit it. And user A also created post B, so they're able to edit that as well. And they're also able to delete these posts, right? So we're coming up with, these are authorization rules. And there's different terms for them depending on what system you're using. Can be called a policy, can be called rules, whatever. But basically it's a set of rules that we need to enforce about who is allowed to do what. And down here, user B can edit and delete post B or post C or whatever this post is, I guess. Okay. Now, and maybe I'll add a little note here. Created by user A. And this one's also created by user A, and this one's created by user B. Okay. Now, maybe there's also a moderator role, right? So there's somebody who's a moderator. And this person is able to delete posts, anybody's post, but they're not able to edit posts, right? Like that. And then maybe there's also an admin, an administrator. This is maybe the person who runs the site. And they probably have access to the database, so they can access this data directly without even following the authorization rules. There's no point in limiting their access at the application layer because it's not securing anything because of their unlimited access to the database. So we give them the ability to edit and delete anything. They can just do whatever needs to be done in the application. Not every application follows these rules. This is just an example, right? And it can get much more complicated than this. And of course, all of these user types fall into this bucket of anyone as well. So they, of course, can still view any of these other posts. Now, When we start talking about administrator and moderator, these aren't necessarily individual users. They could be, but these could also be roles. A role that a user takes on. You are a moderator. Maybe there's 5 moderators. And that's when you start talking about something called role-based access control, which is a scheme that you use to authorize access to different entities. And this is all talking about authorization so far. So role-based access control is an example where a user has a role. That role gives them certain permissions over certain entities. And that same role can be applied to other users and so on. And again, it gets complicated. There's some interesting schemes where there's reusable policies that you can apply to roles and things of that nature. If you think about AWS IAM or GCP IAM, if you use those cloud services, they're basically implementing a more complex version of this RBAC, this role-based access control authorization scheme. Okay, so this kind of concept, understanding this mess of lines, linking users and roles to actions on entities, is authorization. And when you're implementing an app, you should always be thinking, whenever you have an entity, who is authorized to access it and how am I enforcing that authorization? This is a key element of your application security model. But there's another important part of it as well, which is authentication. And the idea of authentication is to prove that you are who you say you are, basically. So say you're user A. User A has access to edit and delete these posts. I am user A, me, Luke Turner. But how do I prove to the system that I am user A? I don't want just anybody to be able to say, hey, I'm user A, and then they can access my data or edit or delete my posts. That's not right. Somehow the system has to authenticate me as me. And usually the way that this is done is with something like a username and password. Or nowadays, there's things like a pass key. There's multi-factor authentication, which is when you have authentication that involves, say, a password, something you know, as well as a phone or an authenticator device, which is something you own. And that's kind of the idea behind multi-factor authentication. Usually is it's something you know combined with something you own. But there's a variety of different options that authentication can be done. Another one is by delegating it to a third-party system using something called SSO, single sign-on, or there's various approaches to that as well. So authentication can get really complicated. Authorization can get really complicated, but both of them can also be quite simple depending on what your app is trying to accomplish. But there's a lot of gotchas involved in both of them as well. In any case, that's kind of the idea between authentication and authorization. Usually the two come as a pair, because if you need to authorize people to access data, you need authentication to prove that they are who they say they are. And conversely, if you're authenticating users to prove that they are who they say they are, usually the only reason you're doing that in the first place is because they need to be authorized to do something. If your data is entirely public, if you don't have the ability to edit or delete anything, this stuff all goes away. There's just viewing. Like, for example, say you have a static blog hosted online, static HTML. Anyone can view those files, and all you can do is view them. There's no other authorization, and there's no authentication that's needed either because of that. So that's my spiel on authentication and authorization. All right? I'm probably going to make that a highlight or something.